Okay, so here we are, week 4. We are finishing up poetry this week, but we are also embarking upon the Victorian Age. Now, this is most of the 19th century, and it's called the Victorian Age simply because Queen Victoria was in power. She was the Queen of England, Britain, from 1830 to 1901, during which time the British Empire really starts to dominate the world. We talked about industrialization before. That industrialization means more big factories, which means a greater need for raw materials, which means Britain starts making more sailing vessels, going out and colonizing the world to, frankly, steal their raw goods and materials to bring them back to England and make stuff, which they then sold to the rest of the world, making everyone, the rich people, very rich. During this time, in fact, the population of London alone goes from 2 million to 6.5 million. Also, since there were very few regulations for most of this period, that enhanced the rich people's ability to get richer, which made the poor people poorer, which led to a lot of civil unrest. And unlike a lot of Europe and the world, England was lucky, I guess, in this way. They capitulated. They reformed things. They changed the way they were doing business a little bit here and there. They did eventually start adding regulations, a little bit here and there over this period of 70 years to try to stem this sense that they might fall and lose their reign, right? They wanted to keep their monarch, unlike many other European countries. This, however, also led to a spirit among British people, and English in particular, that we're studying, of a certain superiority. Like, we're better than everybody else. We haven't had these massive unrests, and look at us, conquering the world. So, Victorian Age, nutshell. Then our two poets this week would be Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who was, in fact, during her lifetime, more famous than her husband that you might have heard of, Robert Browning. So that's a good reason, if not any other reason, to take a look at Elizabeth Barrett Browning's poetry. She was also heavily socially engaged. The poems we're looking at, I tried to pick some lighter ones, and maybe some of you might be poetried out. Also some shorter ones. But she did write, several very engaged poems. Talking about child labor. There was massive child labor. I just was saying how there was not much from the way of regulation for most of this period. They believed in what's called laissez-faire economics, which is frankly what the right-wing Republicans in America want to do. We've already tried it. It was miserable. But there's this really long poem from her called The Cry of the Children. I didn't assign it, but here's a taste. She says, "Do you hear the children weeping, O my brothers? Ere the sorrow comes with years. They are leaning their young heads against their mothers, and that cannot stop their tears. The young lambs are bleating in the meadows. The young birds are chirping in the nest. The young fawns are playing with the shadows. The young flowers are blowing toward the west. But the young children, O my brothers, they are weeping bitterly. They are weeping in the playtime of the others, in the country of the free," which is meant to be ironic, and it goes on for another 150 lines or so. But I think you get a little flavor, a little gist of that. It's sort of a social protest poem against child labor. However, ironically, her education came from the slave trade of her family. When that was abolished and people were held accountable, they did lose most of their money. She eventually does run away with Robert Browning. Her father forbade their marriage. They lived in Italy until the end of their days, or her days at least. But yeah, her poems were sort of written in a different vein from the romanticism that we've been looking at. We talked about the egoism, the egotistic nature sometimes of romantic poets. Last week, these poems were written less to extol or build up her own ego, or even just show how my mind works. Look how neat that is. And more to engage with social issues and human concerns, as we'll see, grief, love, the loss of children, and such like that. So that's, again, crash course, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Give us a little bit of time here to also then talk about our other poet of the week, Alfred Tennyson. You'll see him sometimes called Alfred Lord Tennyson, but I don't know. In the United States, we usually don't, in my view, just use these titles, right? That's half the reason we fought 2 wars against England, to not recognize people's lordly titles. So if you want to call him Alfred Lord Tennyson, that's fine, but I prefer just Alfred Tennyson. He became the poet laureate of England after having some success with his early poetry. In other words, the national poet of the nation, frankly, taking over from William Wordsworth. So Wordsworth passes away. They give the job to our boy Alfred Tennyson here. He, he was big time national pride poet, right? Obviously, if he's the national poet of a country. He also sort of, a big thing about this expansion of an empire and creation of a whole new world that sort of leads to what we will think of as modernity or modernism, does leave a lot of people feeling a sense of loss of the olden days, right? I mean, that always happens when there's innovation and creation. People feel like it's not as good as the old days. So there's a certain amount of that sort of combination of a sense of loss in some of Tennyson's work, as well as, again, connected to this national pride, which leads to glamorizing Arthurian stories. We're gonna have a couple of poems. Well, I think we have one poem that's straight up Arthurian, and some others that I don't know, maybe have something of a vibe of that. But a lot of his stuff does deal with either Arthur stuff or heroism, right? He's got the Charge of the Light Brigade is on our list for this week, which is not about Arthur. It's about a contemporary to him battle that occurred in the Crimean War. The Crimean War is this almost silly war that happened between Russia trying to assert its wanting to be an empire, and there's a lot of these European powers are watching England grow and kind of wanting to do that too. So Russia's trying to expand, and one of their oldest tricks in the book, they do it almost every time they want to start a war, is they say there are either people who are of our Orthodox faith living in your borders and you're not treating them right, or they'll say there are Russian people or Russian-speaking people in your country and we need to kind of invade and come protect them. So that's oversimplifying what was kind of happening, but that leads to more or less the Crimean War, and almost all of the Western powers like England and France come to the defense of what was then the Ottoman Empire that they attacked, which is most of which is current day Turkey. Anyway, don't need to know everything about the Crimean War, but there was this one battle in the Crimean War called the Battle of Balaclava. And what happened was, there's a little bit of controversy here, but what we do know is that there was a miscommunication. An order was sent, it was hastily written, delivered with some verbal, spoken further explanation. And we can't find out about that because the people who gave and received those pieces of verbal information died in what subsequently happens. This light brigade, small horses, not meant to make big attacks on major fortified areas, were told to charge at those cannons on the hill. And rather than send back, is that really what you want us to do? Time was of the essence. They couldn't get on the horn and call anybody. They'd have to send a rider several miles over, and apparently part of his verbal explanation was, we need to do this right now. So they did. They charged up this hill. They got slaughtered by cannon fire. More than half of them died. Died or were wounded. I think less than half of them survived, basically. So it was a terrible, terrible slaughter, and we'll see Tennyson's poetic take on that historical event this week. The only other thing I want to add some further context to is just that there's a poem called Lotus Eaters. It's not super long, but it's on the longer side, and I think you'll be totally lost if you've never heard of what a lotus eater is. And that just goes back to Homer's Odyssey. Odysseus, super long story, very, very short. I mean, it's literally an epic. Odysseus lost at sea for a very long time, makes many different stops, has misadventures, mishaps. One of the places they stop, his crew finds that there's this thing called a lotus that if they eat, they don't care about anything anymore. They don't care about trying to get home anymore. I mean, they've been trying to get home for a decade. So it's been connected to potential drug use, this ancient story. These guys they ate this thing on this island and they didn't give a crap about anything else anymore. They wanted to stay on the island, and it was very difficult for the captain of the ship, Odysseus, to get them back on board and get going home again. So you'll see a lot of things about guys, like the poem talks about guys landing on an island, and it's kind of, well, I've got a discussion question, so I don't need to get into that too much more. I mean, that's basically the thing. It's it makes you not care about anything. You want to laze about and not do anything anymore. Things that are supposed to be really important to you, like getting back to your family. If you eat this lotus, you don't care anymore. So, I guess that's pretty much it. The poems are posted, the discussions are there. I just want to remind you to keep up with everything, and soon you'll see my final thoughts for week 2, and then this week I'm hoping to get final thoughts for week 3. So do make sure you keep up with the discussion boards and go back and read my final thoughts. And as always, you have my email address. It's on the syllabus. So do make sure you put 1 T in there. It's not a typo. I only have 1 T in my first name, or else I won't get the email. So I haven't gotten from many people. So any questions, please email me. I'll get back to you. And otherwise, yeah, enjoy the last week of poetry, and maybe even think about getting started on the beginnings of hard times if you can find the time, because, well, talk more about that next week. But it is 19th century prose, and I'm only giving you 100 pages, but you have a week, so you know your reading style or tendencies better than I do. All right, that is it. I will see you guys next time.